The cobbled streets of Rue des Écrivains were quiet that morning, the usual hum of Paris waking up dampened by an unusual hush. The small bookshop, Librairie Vernier, had always been a fixture of the neighborhood, its dark wooden shelves packed tight with rare and antique books, its air thick with the scent of old paper and ink. But today its shutters remained closed. A passerby might not have thought twice about it. Perhaps the owner had fallen ill, or simply decided to open late. But inside, something was terribly wrong. The little brass bell above the door jingled as Inspector Jules Morel pushed it open. He had been called early. Too early for a minor complaint, which meant something serious had happened. The interior of the shop was dim, dust swirling in the shafts of morning light filtering through the curtains. The books stood as they always had, but there was an absence, a silence that told him something was missing before he even looked. Paul Vernier, the bookshop's owner, was gone. His assistant, a young man named Emile, had arrived just after dawn to unlock the shop and prepare for the day. He had knocked once, then twice. No answer. After using his spare key, he had stepped inside and found the shop exactly as it had been left the night before, except for the fact that its owner had vanished. No sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no missing books or valuables, just an eerie, unnatural emptiness. Morel scanned the small counter where Vernier always sat, scribbling notes on sales receipts. A cup of coffee had gone cold beside an open ledger. A single book lay there, its pages slightly curled, as though someone had been reading it moments before their disappearance. Morel picked it up. Les Mémoires du Diable. The Devil's Memoirs. An old, rare edition, but not valuable enough to kill for. He turned to Emile. Was the door locked when you arrived? Yes, from the inside, the young man said, wringing his hands. I had to use my key, the inspector nodded. And nothing else is missing? Emile shook his head. The cash register is untouched. Even the rarest books are still here. It's as if he simply stepped out and disappeared. A locked room mystery. The kind Morel despised the most. Too simple on the surface, yet impossible when examined closely. The absence of a crime was often the trickiest crime of all. He crouched behind the counter, running his fingers over the wooden floorboards. No. Hidden trapdoor. The back door had been bolted from the inside. No sign of forced entry, no scuff marks, no blood, no notes left behind, just an open book and a missing man. Morel flipped through Les Mémoires du Diable, pausing on a page where a sentence had been underlined in dark ink. Le diable ne vole pas les âmes, il attend qu'elles se perdent. The devil does not steal souls, he waits for them to lose their way. He exhaled slowly. A coincidence, perhaps, or a clue. But a clue to what? Inspector Jules Morel let the underlined passage linger in his mind as he set the book down, his fingers brushing against the brittle pages. The sentence was too deliberate to ignore. Someone had meant for it to be found. But by whom and why? The officers who had arrived ahead of him were already doing what they did best, checking the perimeter, asking the usual questions. Had anyone seen Paul Vernier leave last night? Had anyone heard unusual noises? Any signs of forced entry? But Morel knew that the absence of answers was an answer itself. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The locked door and untouched register made it seem as though Vernier had simply ceased to exist. Morel's gaze swept the room again, trained to catch what others overlooked. A shop like this was its own kind of puzzle, its careful disorder concealing meaning in the smallest details. The counter was tidy, the books on the nearest shelves arranged neatly, except for one. A single volume, barely noticeable, was slightly out of place among the others. He stepped toward it, fingers tracing the spine. La Peau de Chagrin by Balzac. Not rare, but its position bothered him. The books beside it stood flush, yet this one jutted just slightly forward, as if it had been removed and replaced in haste. He pulled it from the shelf. A thin piece of paper slipped from its pages, fluttering to the floor. Morel picked it up. A receipt from a café 2 streets away, Le Perake Bleu. The time-stamp read 10:45 p.m. last night, barely an hour before Vernier would have locked up for the evening. The inked total showed a single espresso and something scratched out beneath it. Someone had tried to erase part of the order, but the faintest impression remained. A second item had been there. Another coffee? A pastry? Or had someone been with Vernier? He turned back to Emile, who had been hovering by the door, watching nervously. Did Monsieur Vernier often go out for coffee this late? Emile hesitated. Not usually. He was a creature of habit. If he had coffee, it was here, in his shop. He nodded toward the cold cup, still resting on the counter. And he never went to Le Perroquet Bleu. He said it was too loud. Morel studied him for a moment. The young man was fidgeting, but not in the way of someone hiding a lie, more like someone unsure of how much to say. And yet, Morel said, holding up the receipt, he was there last night. Emile's brows furrowed. I don't understand. Neither did Morel. Not yet. He pocketed the receipt and took another slow look around the shop. The officers were finishing their routine checks, one of them muttering about a complete lack of fingerprints on the back door. Vernier's or anyone else's. It was as if no one had touched it at all. Morel turned back to the counter, his eyes falling once. Mort en Lemoir Diablo. The placement was deliberate, the underlined sentence too precise to be chance. And then there was something else, something subtle, something that made the hair on his arms rise. The book was open to a page on the left, but the right-hand page had a faint, almost imperceptible indentation, as if someone had pressed down while writing on a separate sheet of paper placed over it. The page itself was blank, but the pressure of the pen had left a trace. Morel carefully lifted the book, angling the paper toward the light. He could just make out a few faint impressions, the letters uneven but distinct enough to read Rue des Martyrs. Midnight. His pulse quickened. A meeting place? A warning? Had Vernier gone there willingly, or had someone forced his hand? He slipped the book into a protective sleeve before placing it carefully into his coat pocket. Emile, he said, his voice measured. Was there anything different about Monsieur Vernier yesterday? Anything at all? Emile hesitated again, then nodded slowly. He seemed distracted. He kept checking the time. He even closed early, which he never does. He swallowed. I thought maybe he had a date. He used to, well, there was someone he used to see. Morel raised a brow. Who? A woman. I never met her, but he mentioned her once or twice. Said she liked poetry. But they hadn't spoken in months. A ghost from the past, perhaps? Or a loose thread waiting to be pulled? Morel exhaled and glanced once more around the shop. Everything pointed to a man who had left voluntarily, but then why had he locked the door from the inside? Why had he left behind a full register, a cold coffee, and a deliberate message? Nothing about Paul Vernier's disappearance made sense, but Morel knew one thing for certain. It had not been an accident. The rain had begun to fall in a light drizzle by the time Inspector Jules Morel stepped out of Librairie Vernier, the scent of damp stone rising from the cobbled streets. He pulled his coat tighter and glanced once more at the receipt from Le Perake Bleu. It was a small café, just 2 streets away, close enough for Paul Vernier to stop by after closing his shop, but far enough for it to be out of his usual routine. Morel had a feeling the café would offer more questions than answers, but he had little choice but to follow the trail where it led. By the time he reached Le Perroquet Bleu, the street lamps were flickering to life, casting pale pools of light across the wet pavement. The café was a modest place, neither upscale nor run down, with a few scattered patrons hunched over their drinks. A young woman with dark curls was behind the counter, polishing glasses with the ease of someone who had done so 1,000 times before. She looked up as he entered, her gaze assessing. Morel approached the counter, setting the receipt down in front of her. "You were working last night?" She gave him a slow nod. "I always do." He tapped the faintly erased portion of the receipt. "Do you remember who ordered this?" The woman frowned, wiping her hands on her apron as she peered at the slip. "That's our ink. We sometimes cross things out if a customer changes their order." Her eyes flicked back to his. "Why?" "Paul Vernier," Morel said, watching her carefully. "He was here around 10:45 p.m. Did you see him?" Her lips pressed together as if considering how much to say. "Maybe." Morel raised an eyebrow. "Maybe?" She sighed, glancing around the room before leaning in slightly. "He came in, yes. Sat near the window. Looked nervous. Kept checking the door." "Was he alone?" A brief hesitation. Then, "No. A man joined him not long after." Morel felt his pulse quicken. "Describe him." She shook her head. "I didn't get a good look. He kept his coat on, hat low." "Older than Vernier, I think." They talked for maybe 20 minutes. Then Vernier left first. The other man waited a few minutes before following. Did they argue? No, but it wasn't friendly either. More like business, but tense. She hesitated again, biting her lip. Vernier left money on the table, but the other man took it before following him out. Morel frowned. That was an odd detail. "You didn't stop him?" She shrugged. "Not my problem." He studied her for a moment. There was something she wasn't saying, but pressing too hard might make her shut down entirely. "Did you recognize the man?" "No," she said too quickly. Morel held her gaze. "But you've seen him before." Her jaw tightened. Then with a sigh, she leaned in once more. "He comes in sometimes, never stays long. Always watches people more than he eats." She hesitated, then muttered, "People call him Le Suisse." Morel's breath stilled. The name was familiar. Not a real name, of course, just an alias whispered among those who dealt in debts, secrets, and quiet threats. Le Suisse was known for 2 things, discretion and finality. Vernier had met with a fixer. And now he was gone. Morel straightened, slipping the receipt back into his pocket. "If he comes in again, you'll let me know." She gave a wary nod. "If I see him?" It wasn't a promise, but it was enough for now. Back on the street, the rain had thickened, tapping against the brim of Morel's hat. The night had taken a turn. What had seemed like a simple disappearance was shaping into something else entirely. Vernier hadn't just vanished. He had been meeting someone in secret, handling something that made him nervous. And then there was Le Suisse, a man whose presence usually meant only one thing. A debt had come due. Morel exhaled slowly. It was time to speak to the one person who would have known if Vernier was in trouble. Emile had given the name reluctantly, but Morel knew the type of relationship he had hinted at. Paul Vernier had once been involved with a woman who loved poetry. That description alone had been thin, but Morel had a suspicion. He knew of one woman in Vernier's orbit who fit the description, someone who had once been close to him but had since drifted away. Clare Duval. She owned a small second-hand bookstore on the edge of Montmartre, a quieter place than Vernier's, filled more with forgotten novels than rare treasures. By the time Morel arrived, the shop was already closing, the last of the evening's customers stepping out as Claire turned the sign on the door. She saw him approaching and hesitated before unlocking the door again. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said quietly, stepping aside. Morel followed her in, the scent of paper and dust settling around him. "Then you already know," she nodded, crossing her arms. "Paul is missing." Morel studied her carefully. Her expression was guarded, but there was something else, something unreadable beneath the surface. "When did you last see him?" Claire hesitated, just long enough for Morel to notice. 2 days ago." "You're sure?" A slight tension in her jaw. "Yes." Morel reached into his coat and pulled out the book Vernier had left open. "Les Mémoires du Diable." He set it on the counter, watching her reaction closely. Her breath hitched, barely noticeable, but Morel caught it. She exhaled slowly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "That book. I gave it to him." Morel tilted his head. "Recently?" "A long time ago." She ran a finger over the worn cover. "He never cared much for it, but he kept it. I thought he had forgotten about it." Morel let the silence stretch between them before saying, "He underlined a passage." Claire's eyes flicked up to his. He opened the book, turning it toward her, and pointed to the sentence. "The devil does not steal souls. He waits for them to lose their way." She stared at it for a long moment, then said softly, "Paul used to say that all the time." Morel frowned. "What do you mean?" Her fingers tightened slightly against the book's spine. "It was something he believed, that people make their own mistakes, that no one forces them into ruin. He always said he would never be the kind of man who lost his way." Morel studied her. "Did he?" She didn't answer immediately. Then after a long moment she whispered, "I think he was afraid he had." Morel exhaled, stepping back. Every answer only led to more questions. Paul Vernier had been afraid. He had been meeting someone in secret. And now he was gone, but fear wasn't always about running. Sometimes it was about knowing there was nowhere left to run. The rain had turned into a steady downpour by the time Inspector Jules Morel left Clare Duval's bookstore. He walked without hurry, his mind sorting through the tangle of details he had gathered. Paul Vernier had been afraid. That much was clear. But fear alone did not explain his disappearance. The man had locked his own shop from the inside, left behind a deliberate clue, and had been seen meeting Le Suisse just before vanishing. Fear might have set everything in motion, but it wasn't the full story. Morel took shelter beneath a cafe awning, shaking the raindrops from his hat. He needed to break this case apart piece by piece. Every suspect had a reason to be involved, yet none of their motives tied everything together. Emile, the nervous assistant, had been visibly shaken, but not entirely forthcoming. Had he truly known nothing about Vernier's troubles, or had he chosen which truths to share? Then there was Clare Duval, who had spoken of Vernier's fears, but had held something back. Her reaction to the book had been too strong for mere sentiment. Had she played a role in whatever had happened to him? And then there was Le Suisse, the fixer. His presence changed everything. If Vernier had been dealing with someone like that, The stakes were far higher than a simple disappearance. Le Suisse did not involve himself in petty matters. He was called in when problems needed permanent solutions. Morel pulled the café receipt from his pocket again, staring at the erased portion. What had Vernier originally ordered? Or, more importantly, had someone wanted to hide what it was? A thought struck him, and he turned on his heel, retracing his steps toward Le Perake Bleu. The young woman behind the counter looked up, her expression wary. "Back so soon?" Morel placed the receipt on the counter. "What was erased here?" She hesitated, shifting her weight. "I told you sometimes customers change their orders." "Or sometimes they don't," Morel cut in. "And someone doesn't want their order on record." He tapped the receipt. "Was it another coffee?" "Or something else?" she exhaled sharply, looking around before lowering her voice. "It was a note. I don't know what it said." Vernier asked for a scrap of paper, wrote something down, and had me give it to the man he was with. Morel's pulse quickened. "And you didn't think to mention that before?" She crossed her arms. "I serve a lot of people, Inspector, and not everyone likes having their messages remembered." Morel leaned in slightly. "Do you remember anything about what he wrote?" Her brow furrowed. "Just a few words. Something about time running out." The weight of those words settled heavily in Morel's chest. Time running out for it. What? A deal? A debt? Or something worse? Morel left the café, his thoughts circling back to Le Suisse. He needed to find him. The man was a shadow, operating in the space between legality and crime, but he had contacts, places he frequented. Morel knew where to start. The Chat Noir was a different kind of establishment, a private club hidden behind an unmarked door, on a quiet street. It was a place where whispers carried weight, where men like Le Suisse brokered their arrangements. Morel flashed his badge at the doorman, who barely reacted before stepping aside. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and murmured conversation. Morel didn't have to look long. Le Suisse was there, seated in a corner, his presence understated yet undeniable. He was a lean man in his 60s, his silver hair neatly combed, his suit impeccable. He glanced up as Morel approached, a faint smirk appearing, as if he had been expecting him. "Inspector," Le Suisse said smoothly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Morel pulled out the café receipt and set it on the table. "Paul Vernier, you met him last night." Le Suisse glanced at the slip of paper, then returned his gaze to Morel. "I meet many people." "Don't waste my time," Morel said. "He wrote you a message, said time was running out." "Running out for what?" Le Suisse chuckled, taking a slow sip of his drink. "You always were a persistent one, Morel." He exhaled, placing his glass down with deliberate care. Vernier was in trouble. He had debts. Morel wasn't surprised. "With whom?" Le Suisse tilted his head. "You assume there's only one answer to that question, but Vernier's troubles were layered. He owed money, yes, but that was only part of it." Morel narrowed his eyes. "And the other part?" A slow smile. "A woman. Claire." The answer formed in Morel's mind before Le Suisse even said it. "He borrowed money to help someone," Le Suisse continued. "A woman from his past. He never told me her name, but I suspect you already know it." Morel felt the pieces shifting into place. "And when he couldn't pay back what he owed," Le Suisse spread his hands. "He looked for another way out. He came to me hoping for a solution, but I am not in the business of charity, Inspector. He had to make a choice." Morel's jaw tightened. And what choice did he make? Le Suisse regarded him for a long moment, then simply said, "He disappeared." The words hung between them. It wasn't an admission, but it wasn't a denial either. Morel studied the older man's expression, searching for a crack in his carefully composed demeanor. "You don't believe he's coming back?" Le Suisse smiled faintly. "Do you?" Morel didn't answer. Instead, he stood, slipping the receipt back into his coat. As he stepped out into the rain, the web of deception around Paul Vernier was beginning to take shape. He had borrowed money to help Claire. He had met Le Suisse, searching for a way out. And then, with time running out, he had vanished. But one question remained unanswered. Had he disappeared by choice, or had someone made the choice for him? The next morning, the city awoke to headlines declaring the mystery of Paul Vernier's disappearance solved. The police had acted swiftly after Morel's visit to Le Suisse, eager to close the case and move on. A suspect had been arrested, a man with gambling debts linked to small-time loan sharking. A search of his apartment had turned up a watch engraved with Paul Vernier's initials, along with a bundle of letters signed in Vernier's name. To the authorities, it was a clear-cut case. Vernier had owed money, had likely struggled to pay, and had met a predictable, unfortunate end. Morel wasn't convinced. He stood in the narrow confines of Vernier's bookshop, staring at the empty counter where the man had last stood. The crime scene had been processed, dusted for fingerprints, examined for clues. Everything pointed to a simple conclusion, except for the parts that didn't: the lock, the book, the erased cafe receipt, the missing body. Something was wrong, and Morel could feel it, a splinter beneath his skin. The watch and letters had been found too easily, as if someone had wanted the police to find them. The inspector turned as Emile entered, his usual nervous energy heightened. "They've arrested Bernard Lemaitre," Emile blurted out. "I saw it in the papers." Morel nodded. Lemaitre was a known figure in Montmartre's underworld, a collector for larger, more powerful men. He had a history of intimidation, but had never been tied to murder. "Do you believe he did it?" Emile asked, fidgeting with the cuffs of his sleeves. Morel didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at the counter. "Did Vernier ever mention Lemaitre to you?" Emile hesitated. "Not by name, but he was afraid of something. I thought it was just money trouble." Money trouble. Morel exhaled slowly. That was the easy answer. But Vernier had been a careful man, deliberate. If he had been desperate enough to meet Le Suisse, he wouldn't have been careless enough to let a thug like Lemaitre get the better of him. The pieces weren't fitting. Leaving Emile behind, Morel made his way to the police station, where Lemaitre was being held. The man sat behind bars with the easy arrogance of someone who knew how these things worked. He had the look of a man used to playing the villain, broad-shouldered and unshaven, his smirk a permanent fixture. "You're wasting your time, Inspector," Lemaitre said as Morel stepped up to the cell. "They've already decided I did it." Morel folded his arms. "Did you?" Lemaitre laughed, shaking his head. "If I had, do you think they would have found that watch so easily? Someone planted it. I don't kill my debtors, Morel. Dead men don't pay." Morel studied him carefully. He had dealt with men like Lemaitre before, brutes who enforced the rules of the street. But murder wasn't Lemaitre's style. His job was to extract payment, not eliminate the source of it. "And the letters?" Morel pressed. Lemaitre shrugged. "I don't know where they came from. I never met Vernier. He wasn't on my list." Morel frowned. "Then whose list was he on?" Lemaitre's smirk faded slightly. "That's the real question, isn't it? Morel stepped back, his mind working through the possibilities. Lemaitre was right about one thing. The evidence had appeared too conveniently. The real criminal was still out there, watching, waiting, and, if they thought the case was closed, they might make a mistake. Morel left the station, his thoughts returning to Le Suisse. The fixer had known more than he had let on. And then there was Clare. She had admitted to helping Vernier once, but had she been helping him escape, or leading him into a trap? One thing was certain. Paul Vernier's story wasn't over yet. Morel walked through the rain-soaked streets, the city a blur of grey stone and flickering street lamps. Lemaitre's arrest was too neat, too convenient. Someone had orchestrated it, someone who wanted the investigation closed before Morel could dig any deeper. But the real question remained, who had the most to gain from Vernier's disappearance? His thoughts circled back to Clare Duval. She had spoken about Paul Vernier with familiarity, but there had been something else in her voice, regret, perhaps, or something closer to guilt. She had admitted to helping him once, but how much more? Was she hiding? Morel decided to pay her another visit. The bookstore was dimly lit when he arrived, the scent of old paper heavy in the air. Clare looked up from behind the counter, her expression cautious. "I already told you everything I know, Inspector." Morel pulled out his cigarette case, flipping it open before slipping it back into his coat. "I think you told me part of it. But something still doesn't fit. Vernier disappeared because of something in his past, not just his debts. And you were part of that past, weren't you?" Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. "Paul made his own choices." "But he trusted you," Morel pressed. "He came to you, left behind a book only you would recognize. That wasn't a coincidence, Clare. He was trying to tell you something." She exhaled, her shoulders sinking. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Morel waited. Clare reached beneath the counter and retrieved an old newspaper clipping. She slid it across to him without a word. The headline was faded, the ink smudged with time. "Local banker found dead in Seine. Suicide or foul play?" Morel frowned, scanning the article. The name leapt out at him immediately. Emile Vernier. "Paul's father," Clare murmured. The pieces began to shift into place. Morel read on. Emile Vernier had worked at a small private bank, handling accounts for wealthy clients. One evening he had been found floating in the Seine. The official ruling was suicide, but whispers of embezzlement and scandal had followed. A large sum of money had gone missing shortly before his death. The bank had been eager to move on, and the investigation had been quietly buried. Morel looked up. Paul never believed it was suicide. Clare nodded. He was 16 when his father died. The shame nearly destroyed him. He spent years trying to prove his father's innocence, but no one would listen. Morel's mind worked quickly. Paul Vernier's debts weren't just about money, they were about redemption. Had he uncovered something? Was that why he had vanished? "There's something else," Clare said hesitantly. "Paul once told me his father had a secret account, a place where he kept records. He was certain it held the truth about what happened." Morel's pulse quickened. "And did he ever find it?" Clare hesitated. "I think he was close." Morel's thoughts turned to Le Suisse. The fixer dealt in secrets. If Vernier had come, to him it wasn't just for protection. It was because he had uncovered something dangerous. The past and the present were colliding. Paul Vernier's disappearance wasn't just about unpaid debts. It was about an old crime that someone had worked very hard to keep buried. And now Morel had to find out who had the most to lose if the truth came out. Morel left the bookshop. With his collar turned up against the wind, his thoughts tangled. Emile Vernier's death had been dismissed as a suicide, but Paul had never accepted that. He had been chasing the truth for years, and now he was missing. Someone had silenced him before he could uncover something they wanted buried. The question was, who? The old banker's records, if they still existed, were the key. If Paul had found them, they were dangerous. If he hadn't, then someone else was looking. And in Morel's experience, people got careless when they were desperate. A plan began to form. He needed to rattle the cage. Morel returned to the police station and found Emile in the records room, hunched over a stack of old case files. He looked up, startled, as Morel dropped the newspaper clipping onto the desk. Emile Vernier. You ever come across his name before? Emile frowned, adjusting his glasses. The banker? Only in passing. His case was closed long before I joined the force. Morel lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly. Not anymore. I want you to leak a story to the press. Emile blinked. What kind of story? Tell them we've reopened the case, that new evidence has surfaced. Be vague, but then make it sound credible, and make sure the right people hear about it. Emile hesitated. You think that will draw someone out? Morel gave a thin smile. I think whoever wanted Paul Vernier out of the way isn't finished yet. If they believe we're closing in on the truth, they'll make a mistake. By the next morning, the bait had been set. An article ran in Le Matin, a small mention buried beneath reports of political turmoil and financial troubles. New leads in banker's death, investigation to be re-examined. Morel waited. By midday, he had his first sign. Le Suisse sent word that someone had been asking about the old case, wanting to know how much the police actually knew. A second message arrived from Clare. Someone had broken into the bookshop during the night, rifling through papers, but taking nothing. Whoever it was, they were looking for something specific. Morel's instincts told him he was close. He decided to push further. That evening, he paid a visit to Bernard Lemaitre, still locked up in his cell. The enforcer had been uncharacteristically quiet since his arrest, no longer smirking, no longer trying to play the tough man. Morel pulled up a chair outside the bars, watching him. You've been forgotten, Lemaitre, Morel said, lighting another cigarette. Your friends on the outside aren't in a hurry to help you. Lemaitre scoffed, but said nothing. Morel let the silence stretch before casually dropping a folded paper onto the floor just within reach of the cell. Lemaitre hesitated, then picked it up. His eyes skimmed the article. They're digging into old graves now, he muttered. Morel exhaled smoke. Funny thing, don't you think? Vernier's father, money gone missing. Now Vernier himself disappears. Makes you wonder if someone's been covering their tracks for a long time. Lemaitre's fingers tightened around the page. It was subtle, but Morel caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He wasn't just hearing this for the first time. He knew something. You were just a collector, Morel continued. Not the brains behind anything, but maybe, just maybe, you were collecting for someone who's getting nervous right about now. Lemaitre's jaw clenched. He crumpled the newspaper, tossing it aside. You've got nothing, he muttered. Morel smiled faintly. Maybe not yet. But the people you're protecting? They don't trust you. They're letting you rot in here while they clean up their mess. You think they'll still need you when this is over? Lemay was silent. Morel stood, smoothing out his coat. You know where to find me when you decide your loyalty isn't worth your life. As he stepped out into the corridor, he could feel it. Someone was about to crack. Morel stepped out into the damp evening air, the city closing around him in the hush of twilight. The streets felt different, watchful, expectant. His plan had worked. The article had stirred something, shaken someone. He could feel it, the way tension builds before a storm. But storms didn't just bring answers, they swept things away. At the station, he found Emile hunched over his desk, looking uneasy. "Something's happened," the younger officer muttered. Glancing up, Morel flicked his cigarette into the ashtray. "Tell me." Emile hesitated, then pushed a file toward him. "The Vernier case file. It's gone." For a moment, Morel didn't move. Then he slowly unfolded the empty folder, his eyes narrowing. "Gone?" Emile nodded grimly. "I went to retrieve it from the archives. It was there this morning." "Now nothing." Morel turned the folder over, as if expecting something to fall from its emptiness. Someone was scared. Who had access? Emile sighed. "Half the department, technically, but I checked. There was no official request. Someone took it without logging it." Morel's mind moved quickly. The theft wasn't random. It wasn't about Emile Vernier's death. It was about Paul. His father's case had been buried for years, and no one had cared until now. Paul had uncovered something, and now that Morel was closing in, someone had stepped in to erase the trail. "Are there copies?" Emile grimaced. "Officially? No. Unofficially? Maybe." Morel's eyes sharpened. "Maybe?" Emile hesitated. "There's an old clerk, Jean Rousel, been here longer than anyone. He has this habit, makes personal notes on cases, keeps them separate. People call it an obsession, but if he worked on the Vernier case back then, there's a chance he has something." Morel was already moving. Roussel's flat was in a quiet corner of the city, up a narrow stairwell that smelled of dust and old paper. Morel knocked. No answer. He knocked again, sharper this time. The door creaked open. Inside, the flat was a wreck. Papers scattered, desk drawers wrenched open. A lamp lay on its side, casting jagged shadows across the walls. And in the middle of it all, Jean Rousel sat slumped in his chair, unmoving. Morel stepped forward, pulse steady but tight. A glance told him everything. Rousel wasn't dead, just unconscious. A bruise was forming along his temple, his breathing shallow but even. Someone had been here first. Morel moved quickly, scanning the room. Whoever had done this had been looking for something. Roussel's notes. But had they found them? His gaze swept across the overturned desk. Books had been pulled from shelves, files torn apart. But there was one thing out of place. A book still resting neatly on the far end of the desk, untouched. A history of private banking in France. Morel opened it. Between the pages, folded carefully, was a handwritten sheet. Names, dates, figures. Emile Vernier, his clients, his missing money, and at the bottom, one name circled in red ink. Morel's stomach tightened. He knew that name. Someone inside the police force had been tied to the old case, and now they were cleaning up loose ends. Morel refolded the paper carefully, his fingers steady despite the cold wave that swept through his chest. The name circled. In red ink was impossible to ignore. Inspector Raoul Deschamps, a man who had served in the force for decades, well-respected, a fixture in the department. He had been young when Emile Vernier had died, but he had been there. Involved. And now, if Roussel's notes were correct, his hands had never been clean. A groan from the chair made Morel turn. Rousel was stirring, his eyelids fluttering before. They snapped open in alarm. His hand went instinctively to his bruised temple, eyes darting across the ransacked room. Then he saw Morel and relaxed, only slightly. "They took the file," Rousel rasped, his voice rough. "But they didn't find my notes." Morel held up the folded sheet. "This?" The old clerk nodded weakly. "I knew someone would come looking. I just didn't think they'd come so soon." Morel crouched beside him. "Who did this?" Rousel hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "I didn't see. They came from behind." He gestured toward the mess. "They were searching for everything I had on Vernier. They wanted it erased." Morel nodded grimly. "And Deschamps? How does he fit into this?" Rousel swallowed, his throat dry. "He was on the case, but his reports were always incomplete. There were gaps, missing pieces. Money changed hands in ways that didn't make sense. And when Vernier died, Deschamps was the first to say it was a suicide. He shut down any further investigation. The weight of it settled over Morel like a lead blanket. If Deschamps had buried the truth once, he could do it again. And now, with Paul Vernier missing, the stakes were higher than ever. He needed to move fast. Morel helped Rousel to his feet. "You're not safe here," he said. "Whoever did this might come back." Rousel gave a weak nod. "I have a place I can go. I'll be careful." Morel watched him for a moment, then turned toward the door. He had one destination in mind. The police station felt different when you knew there was a traitor inside. Morel walked through the corridors, his senses sharp, his body coiled with tension. He needed to be careful. If Deschamps suspected anything, he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate another loose end. He found Emile at his desk, absorbed in a report. Morel dropped the folded paper in front of him. Emile glanced at it, then frowned as he read. When he reached the circled name, his face paled. "Deschamps," he whispered. "That can't be right." "It's right," Morel said grimly, "and we don't have much time." Emile swallowed hard. If he knows we're onto him, a shot rang out. Both men froze. The sound had come from inside the station. A second shot followed, then the sharp, panicked voices of officers reacting. Morel was already moving. The noise led him to the corridor near the holding cells. Officers were gathered, some shouting, some staring in shock. Morel pushed through the crowd. Lying on the floor, a dark stain spreading beneath him, was Bernard Lemaitre. His eyes were wide, unseeing. His fingers still twitched slightly, but Morel knew there was no saving him. The gun that had killed him lay just outside the bars of his cell. Morel's stomach twisted. Someone had silenced him. His gaze snapped to the officers around him, scanning faces, searching for anything out of place. And then he saw him, Deschamps, standing near the back, his expression carefully blank. Too blank. Morel took a slow step forward. Deschamps met his gaze, and for the briefest second Morel saw it, the flicker of calculation, of recognition. Deschamps turned and walked away. Morel moved to follow, but an officer grabbed his arm. "Lieutenant, what do we do?" He glanced back at Lemaitre's lifeless body. He had been a criminal, but he had known something. And now he had taken that knowledge to the grave. Morel exhaled sharply. "Secure the scene. Nobody touches anything." Then he pushed forward, his focus locked on Deschamps. He reached the main corridor just in time to see the older officer stepping out into the night. The door swung closed behind him. Morel broke into a run. Morel shoved the station doors open and stepped onto the rain-slicked pavement. Deschamps was already moving, his coat collar turned up, his steps quick, but controlled. He wasn't running. He was slipping away, disappearing into the city the way a man with experience knew how. But Morel had been watching men like him for too long. He cut across the street, moving at an angle to intercept, eyes never leaving Deschamps' silhouette. The older inspector turned a corner sharply, vanishing down a narrow alley. Morel followed, his heartbeat steady, his mind working. Why kill Lemaitre now? Deschamps had spent years covering up whatever had happened to Emile Vernier. But Lemaitre had been locked up, waiting to talk. Morel had been too slow, and someone had made sure the criminal never spoke. Had Lemaitre been a loose end, or had he known something dangerous enough to warrant an execution right under the department's nose? The alley opened into a side street, but Morel had expected it. He didn't look for Deschamps in the open. He looked where he would go next. And then he saw it, a dark shape slipping through the doorway of a run-down cafe that looked long since abandoned. Morel crossed the street without hesitation, drawing his revolver before he stepped inside. The interior smelled of damp wood and old tobacco. The only light came from a single weak bulb above the counter. The place had been closed for years, but someone had left faint traces, a half-burned matchbook near the bar, a coat draped over a chair in the corner. Deschamps' coat. Morel kept moving, his gun raised, scanning the shadows. A floorboard creaked. He turned sharply, just in time to see Deschamps step out from behind a stack of old crates, his own revolver in hand. The two men stared at each other. "You're quicker than I thought," Deschamps said, his voice calm, almost resigned. "I suppose that means we finally talk." Morel kept his aim steady. "No more games. You killed Lemaitre." Deschamps exhaled slowly. "I cleaned up a mistake." Morel's jaw tightened. "Vernier wasn't a mistake." Deschamps let out a low chuckle. "No, I suppose he wasn't. But you already know that, don't you?" Morel did. The pattern had been forming in the back of his mind for days, but now, in the silence of this forgotten cafe, everything locked into place. The names in Rousel's notes, the missing money. Lemaitre's sudden appearance, after all. These years, Vernier had discovered something all those years ago, something dangerous. Money laundering, corruption, a network too big for a simple bookkeeper to expose. He had tried, but before he could, Deschamps and whoever he worked with had buried him, literally and figuratively. The case had been declared a suicide and the world had moved on. But Paul Vernier hadn't. His father's death had never sat right with him. And when he finally uncovered the same trail Emile Vernier had been following, he had disappeared. Not out of fear, but because someone had stopped him. Morel took a step forward. "Where is Paul?" Deschamps' fingers tightened on his gun. "Still asking the wrong questions, Lieutenant." Morel felt his pulse steady. "No, I'm not." Deschamps smiled faintly. "Then you already know the answer." And Morel did. The pattern was complete now. Paul hadn't disappeared. He had been taken, just like his father. And unless Morel moved quickly, he would meet the same fate. Deschamps' gun was steady, but Morel could see the slight shift in his stance, the weight of decades pressing on a man who had lived too long in the shadows. He had been in control. For years, always one step ahead, always knowing how to silence a problem before it became a threat. But this wasn't just about covering up an old crime anymore. This was something deeper. Morel kept his own aim steady. "Paul Vernier, where is he?" Deschamps let out a slow breath, as if calculating whether it was worth lying. Then, with a faint, bitter smile, he said, Gone. Morel's grip tightened. Dead? Deschamps tilted his head. No, not yet. It wasn't relief that flooded Morel's chest, it was urgency. Paul was still alive, but that wouldn't last. He needed to push Deschamps while he still had the chance. Morel took a step forward. This was never just about silencing a bookkeeper, was it? Deschamps' jaw twitched. Morel continued, voice sharp. Vernier found something in the ledgers, something that led back to you. He was supposed to be another loose end, like Lemaitre. But it wasn't just him. His son started asking questions. And then Lemaitre. And then Rousel. And now here we are. Deschamps exhaled sharply through his nose. You don't understand. Morel's voice didn't waver. Then explain it to me. For a long moment, Deschamps said nothing. The dim light from the bulb above cast shadows on his face, deepening the lines carved by age and guilt. Then finally, his grip on the gun relaxed, and he lowered it slightly. Vernier's death wasn't about money, he murmured. It was about survival. Morel's stomach clenched, but he said nothing, letting the silence pull the truth from the man in front of him. Deschamps exhaled, the weight of it heavy. You think this was about covering up corruption, about protecting my reputation? His lips twisted in something that might have been amusement, but it faded quickly. Vernier wasn't just an accountant. He was the last man standing in a game he didn't even know he was playing. Morel's mind worked fast. He had expected greed, desperation, even revenge. But this was something else. Deschamps looked up, his gaze sharp. Have you ever wondered why his death was staged as a suicide? Why it had to be so public? Morel frowned. He had. The crime had been sloppy in some ways, too visible, too easily questioned. If Deschamps had wanted to erase Vernier completely, he could have made him disappear. But instead, the man had been found hanging in his own shop, his books scattered at his feet. Someone needed a message sent, Morel said slowly. Deschamps gave a faint nod. Vernier was an accountant for a very particular kind of client, the kind that doesn't tolerate mistakes. Understanding hit Morel like a weight. This wasn't just about police corruption. This went higher, deeper. Who? Morel demanded. Deschamps gave a hollow chuckle. The kind of people who don't have names. A pit opened in Morel's stomach. If that was true, Vernier had never stood a chance. Deschamps shook his head. I didn't kill him. I tried to warn him, but he wouldn't stop. He thought numbers were just numbers. He met Morel's gaze. They're not. Sometimes they're a death sentence. Morel felt the pieces slot into place. And Paul found out. Deschamps nodded. He's been digging for years. I kept an eye on him, but he was careful, too careful. By the time I realized how close he was, it was too late. Morel's pulse pounded. Who has him? Deschamps hesitated. Morel took another step closer, his voice low and firm. If Paul dies, this doesn't go away, you know that. Deschamps studied him. Then finally he sighed. There's a warehouse by the docks. Morel didn't wait. He turned, already moving, but as he reached the door, Deschamps' voice stopped him. Morel. He looked back. Deschamps' expression was unreadable. Be careful what you wake up. Some things don't go back to sleep. Morel didn't answer. He stepped into the night, his mind already racing ahead. He had what he needed. Now he just had to make it in time. The rain had started again, a slow, steady drizzle that soaked into the cracked pavement as Morel pulled up to the docks. The warehouse loomed in the darkness, a hulking shape against the misty glow of the city beyond. The address Deschamps had given him wasn't marked, just another forgotten structure among many, one of the countless places where things disappeared. Without a trace, he killed the engine and stepped out, moving carefully. There was no time to call for backup. If Paul Vernier was inside, he might not have much time left. The silence was thick. A single dim light flickered near a rusted metal door, casting long, shifting shadows. Morel approached, his breath steady, despite the tension tightening in his chest. The door was unlocked. That wasn't a good sign. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The warehouse was nearly empty, pallets stacked in the corners, dust swirling in the glow of a single hanging bulb. And there, in the center of the room, was Paul Vernier. He was bound to a chair, his head slumped forward, but his chest rose and fell. Alive. Morel took a step closer. A click echoed behind him. He froze. A voice, low and composed, cut through the still air. "Detective." Morel turned slowly, keeping his hands visible. Standing in the shadows near the door was a man he had never seen before, but instantly recognized in the way that mattered. Impeccably dressed, his presence radiated control, the kind of quiet authority that came from power, not bravado. A small pistol rested in his hand, steady, deliberate. Morel kept his face neutral. "Let me guess, you're the one I was never supposed to find." The man smiled faintly. "And yet here you are." Morel's mind worked fast. The fact that Paul was still breathing meant this wasn't over yet. The man took a step forward, studying him. "You've been a persistent inconvenience, detective." Morel tilted his head. "I get that a lot." The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Do you know what I find most fascinating about your profession? It's not about truth. It's about belief. People will believe whatever you tell them, as long as you make the pieces fit." His grip on the pistol didn't waver. Morel exhaled slowly. So that's what this was? Framing Deschamps? Making it all point to him so no one looked any further? The man's gaze flickered with something unreadable. Morel pressed. "You wanted Le Maire dead, but you needed a story that the police could sell. A corrupt officer taking care of old business? Easy to accept. Deschamps was always going to take the fall. But Vernier found something bigger, didn't he?" Silence. Then the man smiled. "You're very good, detective, but I have a plane waiting and you have a choice to make." He gestured toward Paul Vernier with his free hand. "You walk away, and he lives." Morel felt the weight of the moment settle over him. A test, a final play. He kept his stance relaxed, his fingers twitching slightly at his side. "I don't walk away," the man sighed, as if disappointed. "Then you won't leave at all." His finger tightened on the trigger. Morel moved. He twisted, sideways as the gunshot exploded in the air, the bullet missing him by inches. His own weapon was up in an instant, but the man was already moving, shifting into the shadows, using the dim light to his advantage. A second shot rang out, and Morel dropped low, rolling behind a stack of crates. The echoes of gunfire faded, replaced by the tense, measured silence of a predator hunting its prey. Morel's pulse was steady. He listened, waited. A shift in the shadows. A breath. Morel swung out from cover, his shot precise. The man staggered back, clutching his shoulder, but he didn't fall. Instead, he smiled. "You really should have walked away." Morel didn't answer. He took a step forward, gun raised. "Drop it." For the first time, the man hesitated. The confidence cracked just slightly. Then with a sharp inhale, he laughed.
"You think this changes anything?" His voice was calm, almost amused.
"There are names you don't know, people you haven't even begun to suspect." Morel kept his aim steady. "And yet here you are, bleeding on a warehouse floor." The man's gaze darkened, but before he could speak, the wail of sirens cut through the night air. Morel didn't look away. "Looks like you missed your plane." For the first time, the man's face betrayed something real. Frustration. The door burst open, officers flooded in, weapons drawn. The man let out a slow breath and let his gun drop to the floor. Morel exhaled, lowering his own weapon as the officers moved in. Paul Vernier let out a soft groan. Morel turned, stepping quickly toward him, untying the ropes. "You're safe now," he murmured. Paul blinked up at him, dazed but alive. "It wasn't just about the money," he rasped. "There's so much more." Morel nodded. "I know." Outside, the sirens continued to wail. The night was far from over, but for now, at least, the game was done. As the sirens faded into the distance and the officers secured the scene, Morel let out a slow breath, rolling the tension from his shoulders. Paul Vernier was alive. The man behind it all, the polished, nameless figure who had orchestrated the deaths of both Lemaitre and Castaing, was in custody. The case, for all its twists and layers, was finally over. Or so it seemed. Paul sat on the back of an ambulance, a wool blanket draped over his shoulders, his face still pale from shock. Morel crouched beside him, his voice low. "You said there was more. What did you mean?" Paul exhaled, glancing toward the officers loading the wounded man into a police van. He wasn't working alone. Morel frowned. "Who?" Paul shook his head. "I don't know. But before they grabbed me, I overheard something, a phone call. He was reporting to someone else, someone higher." His fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. Whoever it was, they already knew Deschamps had been framed. They were making plans to clean everything up. Morel's gut tightened. He'd suspected as much. A man like the one they'd just arrested wasn't the type to act alone. He was a lieutenant, not a king. And if there was someone higher up, someone who had orchestrated this entire conspiracy from a place of untouchable power, then a shout rang out across the docks. Morel's head snapped up just in time to see the police van lurch forward, its tires screeching against the wet pavement. The officers standing nearby reacted too late. The van, which should have been securely in police hands, was already speeding away. Morel surged to his feet. "What the hell just happened?" A panicked officer ran toward him. "The driver! He wasn't one of ours. He must have switched."
"Out before we loaded the suspect!" Morel swore under his breath. It was a professional extraction.
They'd planned for this. He bolted toward his car, yanking open the door as the radio crackled with urgent chatter. "All units, police transport hijacked, suspect in custody has escaped." Morel didn't wait to hear the rest. He slammed the car into gear and took off, the city lights blurring past as he raced toward the only logical destination. Whoever had arranged the escape wouldn't be sloppy. They wouldn't risk a messy shootout or an unpredictable escape route. No, they would vanish cleanly, like they had so many times before, and there was only one way to do that in this city: the private airfield. Morel gripped the wheel tighter. 10 minutes later, he skidded to a stop at the entrance to the airstrip. The place was mostly dark, but a single jet sat waiting on the tarmac, its engines humming softly. The van was already there, parked haphazardly near the runway. The back doors swung open and two figures emerged, one of them still clutching his bleeding shoulder. The mastermind was escaping. Morel stepped out of his car, gun drawn. Not this time. The man froze. Then slowly, he turned to face Morel. That same infuriating calm, that same measured smile. "You're persistent," the man admitted, tilting his head. "I underestimated you." Morel took a step forward. "Who are you reporting to?" the man chuckled. "Come now, detective, do you really think I'll give you that answer?" The jet's door opened. A figure stepped onto the stairs. Morel shifted slightly, trying to get a clear look. And then
his breath caught.
It wasn't some shadowy financier. It wasn't a faceless crime lord. It was someone he knew. Someone who should have had no connection to this case at all. The air grew impossibly still. The person on the stairs met his gaze, and for the first time in his career, Morel felt the ground shift beneath him. This wasn't over. It had never been about Lemaitre or Deschamps, or even the man standing before him now. This went deeper, and now he was staring at the real mastermind. Morel tightened his grip on the gun, his pulse hammering in his ears. The jet's door was open, its stairs lowered, the engines humming with anticipation. The figure standing at the top of the stairs was illuminated by the runway lights, casting long shadows against the tarmac. He blinked once, as if his eyes were deceiving him. But no, the person looking back at him was undeniably real. Prefect Arnaud Dumas, the very man who had pushed Morel to close the case quickly. The man who had dismissed his concerns about Deschamps' wrongful arrest, who had insisted on taking control of the investigation when it threatened to spiral beyond a simple disappearance. The one who had stood beside him in Lemaitre's bookshop on the very first day, feigning concern while steering him away from the truth. Dumas' face was unreadable, but there was no attempt to hide now. His eyes met Morel's with something resembling amusement, as if daring him to make sense of it all. "You shouldn't have come, Morel," Dumas said, his voice calm, almost paternal. "This is bigger than you." Morel took a step forward. "You orchestrated all of this." It wasn't a question. He could see the truth now, every missing piece slotting into place, the forged letters, the erased financial records, the convenient arrests, the execution of Castaigne, who had known too much, the vanishing of crucial evidence just when it threatened to expose the real players, and Paul Vernier's abduction, not as a loose end, but as bait. "You let me get this close?" Morel said, his voice low. "Why?" Dumas sighed, stepping down from the stairs with slow, measured movements. "Because I needed to know if you were truly capable of understanding." He gestured slightly toward the injured man still clutching his shoulder. This one was expendable. He played his part, and now he served his purpose. He smiled faintly. "But you, Morel, you impressed me." Morel felt a slow, creeping disgust coil in his stomach. "You think this is some kind of test?" "In a way, yes," Dumas admitted. "You see, this city, this country, operates on a delicate balance. There are men like me who ensure that balance is preserved, not for money, not for power, but for stability. Order." Morel's jaw clenched. Lemaitre was no threat to that order. He was a bookseller. Dumas smiled faintly. And yet he was also a liability. His shop, his records, contained things that could not be allowed to come to light. He knew it too. That's why he tried to disappear before we could reach him. Morel thought back to the mess in the bookshop, the hidden compartments in Lemaitre's desk. He had been running, not from a debt collector or an old rival, but from forces he knew would not let him live. "Who are you working for?" Morel asked. Dumas tilted his head slightly. "Does it matter? The machine will keep turning, whether you uncover its workings or not." A sharp gust of wind whipped across the runway. The jet's engines whined softly, impatient. Morel knew he had only seconds to
act.
"You're not leaving," he said. Dumas exhaled, almost regretfully. "Morel, you've been sharp so far, sharper than I expected. But if you truly believe you can stop this, then you haven't understood anything at all." He gave a small nod. The injured man in the suit moved, his hand darting toward his coat. Morel barely had time to react. His instincts screamed, and he fired before the gun could be drawn. A sharp crack split the air, and the man collapsed against the stairs, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. Morel turned the gun back on. Dumas. "Hands where I can see them." Dumas didn't move. "And what do you think happens next?" Morel kept his aim steady. "You're under arrest." Dumas chuckled softly. "Are you really so naive?" In the distance, headlights were approaching fast. Police. Vehicles responding to the hijacked van. "Back up. You've lost," Morel said. For the first time, Dumas's mask slipped. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps even anger, crossed his face. He exhaled slowly, then raised his hands, just as the first set of officers arrived, weapons drawn. "Prefect."
"Dumas," one of them stammered, clearly thrown off by the sight. Morel didn't lower his weapon. "Take him into custody." The officers hesitated, but Morel's voice was sharp. "Now!"
They moved in, securing Dumas' hands, pulling him away from the jet. He did not resist. As they led him past Morel, he leaned in slightly, voice barely above a whisper. "You'll regret this," he murmured. Morel met his gaze. "I already do." As Dumas was loaded into the back of a police vehicle, Morel felt the exhaustion settle into his bones. The case was closed, at least on paper. But he knew better. Dumas had not acted alone. This was only the beginning. And somewhere, in the shadows, the machine kept turning. The cold night air settled heavily over the airstrip as the police vehicles pulled away, their flashing lights casting brief, flickering glows against the dark tarmac. Morel stood still, watching as Dumas disappeared into the distance, hands bound, his composed expression never faltering. Even in defeat, the man seemed undisturbed, as if his arrest had been an inevitable inconvenience rather than a true downfall. Morel exhaled, finally lowering his gun. The weight of the past days pressed against him, exhaustion seeping into his bones. The case was over. The mastermind was in custody. And yet something gnawed at him, an itch in his thoughts that refused to
fade. A mystery never ends. He turned, taking in the scene one last time.
The private jet remained grounded, the body of Dumas' injured accomplice lying motionless beside the stairs, his blood pooling against the cold metal. The airport staff, who had been held at gunpoint earlier, were being questioned by the officers, who remained. Everything was wrapping up in a neat, orderly fashion. Too neat. Morel's gaze drifted toward the jet again. Something wasn't right. He walked toward it, ignoring the weary protests of the officers trying to secure the area. The aircraft itself was sleek, pristine, nothing unusual. But as he stepped past the body and onto the first stair, his eyes
landed on something small, something almost insignificant, a book, a single worn leather-bound volume, half-tucked beneath the injured man's outstretched arm.
The edges were frayed, the spine cracked with age. Morel knelt, carefully sliding it free. The cover was unmarked. He flipped it open, his brow furrowing at the sight of handwritten pages, dense with notes, sketches, and dates. The ink had faded, in places, but one name stood out instantly. Lemaitre. Morel's pulse quickened. He turned a few pages, scanning the hurried script, his mind working to make sense of what he was seeing. This wasn't a simple ledger, it wasn't a journal either. It was a record, a fragmented, meticulous account of something deeper, of connections, of people, of secrets. And then, near the bottom of one page, a note scrawled in the margin. The wheel does not stop turning. Morel's grip tightened around the book. Dumas had called it a machine, had insisted that the system would continue with or without him. And now, staring at these pages, Morel understood. Lemaitre had not been an anomaly. He had been a thread in something much larger. The case wasn't over. It had never been just about a missing bookseller. Morel stood slowly, tucking the book inside his coat. He glanced once more at the flashing lights disappearing into the night, carrying Dumas away. The man had lost this round, but Morel knew the truth now. Dumas had never been the end of the story. There were others still watching. Others still moving their pieces. Morel turned from the jet, stepping off the stairs, his mind already shifting, already preparing for what came next. Because the real mystery had just begun.